24 years ago, an entire high school wrestling team mysteriously vanished during a school trip to Blackmore Lake in England. With no bodies or clues, the authorities quickly concluded it was a tragic accident, abandoning the investigation for lack of evidence. However, one desperate father never accepted that explanation. For decades, Mark Green lived obsessed with the loss of his son, Chris, unable to surrender to the uncertainty. Until one day, while sorting through old belongings, he accidentally found a forgotten diary. Its pages contained unsettling hints no one had seen before. Strange figures wearing white masks, watching from the shadows. A chilling detail that would lead Mark to unearth secrets buried for decades, unveiling a dark conspiracy involving the entire town. What began as a personal quest for answers would soon trigger unimaginable events, shaking an entire community forever. The wind was strangely strong on the afternoon of September 10, 1998. In Trowbridge, a small English town usually proud of its peaceful rural atmosphere. Blackmore Lake, ordinarily serene, seemed to stir with a sinister murmur. Around its banks, the scenery took on shades of gray and brown, as if the leaves and water had lost all vibrancy overnight. There was no apparent reason. Nobody noticed it consciously, except for a group of young athletes arriving in a school bus to celebrate their latest victory. It was the St. James High School wrestling team led by 16-year-old captain Chris Green. Tension filled the bus. Although the trip was supposed to be a reward, several of the boys felt uneasy. Why had they picked that particular lake instead of a closer one, or one with safer facilities? The teacher in charge of the club, Mr. Campbell, was enthusiastically talking about the local Blackmore legend, a tale of aquatic creatures and mysterious lights over the water at night. Just a bunch of small-town superstitions, Mr. Campbell kept repeating with a forced little laugh. But superstition rarely comes alone. Those rumors were no coincidence. Nobody knew it yet, but events were about to unfold that would change Trowbridge's history forever. Amid the chatter and murmurs, Chris stared out the bus window at the lake. A strange pressure weighed on his chest that he couldn't explain. He saw, or thought he saw, a figure on the shore, someone wearing a mask, staring straight at him. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was a fatigue-induced hallucination. Who the heck would hang out at the lake's edge wearing a mask? He thought, not daring to say anything to his friends. That image would haunt him for hours. His heart pounded as if trying to warn him of something. Minutes later, the group arrived at the designated spot for their day out. The area was almost deserted. Even so, the kids hopped off, excited, arms loaded with towels and food. They set up near the water and started playing around immediately. Chris, however, couldn't shake the feeling of looming danger. When he slipped away from the group to walk along the shore, he came across strange footprints sunk into the muddy ground. They looked human, but something about the shape was off, long, marked by an odd arch. A chill ran down his spine. Was someone watching them? He pulled out his notebook, a small journal he always carried, and scribbled in rushed handwriting. Footprints on the shore. Don't look like a normal visitor's. I'm scared, but I don't want to freak out the others. That was the last entry recorded before the wrestling team vanished without a trace. No witnesses, no solid clues. Local authorities searched Trowbridge for weeks, scouring the depths of the lake with divers and sonar, but found absolutely nothing. That day left a scar on the town's memory. Years later, Mark Green, Chris's father, was living in an old house on the outskirts of Trowbridge. He had spent most of his life since the incident trying to understand why his son disappeared in such a way. It felt like an endless nightmare. Mark's marriage had fallen apart a few years after 1998. Guilt, uncertainty, and obsession destroyed the relationship. Now he lived alone with his memories, surrounded by dusty books and items related to his own investigations. One afternoon, while cleaning the old library he used to share with Chris, a heavy book slid off a shelf, revealing a hidden compartment behind it. Wrapped in a yellowed cloth was a small notebook in his son's handwriting. Mark felt his stomach drop. His heart pounded so hard that it was difficult to breathe. He sat down immediately to read it. The pages contained seemingly trivial details of teenage life, training sessions, chats with friends, hallway pranks. But as he kept reading, the tone grew darker. For weeks I felt like someone's watching us. I saw figures on the shore wearing white masks. No idea if I should tell my dad. He might think I'm nuts. Mark trembled. He did not recall ever seeing this diary before. Figures on the shore? Masks? He said out loud. The silence in the house seemed to wrap around him with an almost tangible chill. His entire body reacted to those words, like an abyss opening under his feet. In the final pages, Chris gave a more detailed account of a terrible premonition that something bad would happen at the lake. I don't want to worry anyone, but I have to write it here. We've got that trip tomorrow, and I just don't feel safe. I'm scared, though I can't explain why. This diary was proof that it wasn't just some random accident or disappearance. Mark, who had always doubted the official story, now had confirmation there was something far more sinister behind everything. For years he had tried to ignore the tiny clues he found in his private searches. However, reading his own son's words shook him in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. Who were these masked figures? Why were they watching the kids? Was it an ambush? Mark's mind flooded with questions he couldn't ignore. He woke up early the next day after a sleepless night. Clutching the diary, he decided to revisit Blackmore Lake for the first time in years. The memory of the day the authorities told them there were no bodies still haunted him. He never could face that shoreline without reliving the anguish. Now, though, he felt an urge stronger than fear. He'd found something that tied him to Chris and to the truth. He arrived at the lake at sunset. The sky was overcast and the water looked darker than usual. He walked slowly, examining every rock and tree, as if searching for traces he might have missed 2 decades ago. Everything seemed desolate, but there was an odd, almost electric tension in the air. The old wooden pier creaked beneath his feet. He stopped at its end, gazing at the lake's surface, recalling the last photo he had of Chris smiling under a brighter sky, full of hopes of winning the wrestling tournament. "What happened to you?" Mark murmured, his voice choked with emotion. A sudden gust rippled the water, and for a moment he thought he saw a flash beneath the surface, as if something was moving down there. His heart skipped a beat. He clutched Chris's diary to his chest. Was it his imagination, or was there really something down there that didn't want to be discovered? He cautiously made his way down a small path around the lake, looking for any sign of footprints or anything recent that might confirm his suspicions. The damp ground held odd marks, but they were too irregular to be conclusive. Still, he felt the same tightness Chris had described in the diary. A sense of foreboding burrowed into his chest like a dart. As darkness started to fall, Mark decided to leave. He hadn't found a clear trail, but his gut told him not to drop his guard. Maybe he'd have more chances at night, although that obviously carried serious risk. Getting into his car, his mind spun in circles. Chris mentioned masks, faceless figures. I can't just let this go. Back home, he studied his son's diary over and over, word by word. He jotted down the names of teammates, coaches, practice dates. Every detail could be crucial. He remembered that back then, the authorities rushed to label the event an accident, claiming the bus must have fallen into the lake and that underwater currents had dragged the bodies away. But Mark had always questioned that conclusion. How was it possible that not a single fragment of the vehicle, not a single backpack or personal belonging, had ever surfaced? On his living room table, Mark spread out old newspaper clippings with headlines like, "Mysterious Disappearance at Blackmore. No conclusive evidence." Another article mentioned that, in the days leading up to the school trip, there'd been a local festival by the lake. Several witnesses reported strange movements at night, men in hooded robes around midnight. But no one dug deeper. They were just small-town rumors, easily brushed aside. Time ticked by, and darkness filled the house. Mark turned on a lamp. He made himself some tea to calm his nerves. Each sip made him shudder. He wondered if he was crazy for wanting to go back there so late. but memories of Chris and the undeniable possibility of some criminal plot fueled him. He felt like he had nothing to lose now. Around 10 at night, he gathered his courage and drove back to Blackmore. The road snaked between gentle hills and pitch-black fields, with hardly any lighting. The moon hid behind thick clouds, casting distorted shadows on the pavement. With each passing mile, that sense of danger intensified. When he finally arrived, the silence was eerie. He turned off the engine and got out. The sound of his footsteps, muffled by wet grass and mud, echoed dully in the quiet. He moved towards the wide shore, flashlight trembling in his hand. Then he saw something half buried in the sand. He walked closer, slowly. It was a white mask, just like the one Chris described. Blank expression, no mouth, only 2 black holes for eyes. Mark felt an icy shiver shoot up his spine. Who would leave something like that there in the middle of the night? He crouched down and picked it up, brushing away the damp earth clinging to it. At that moment, he heard a snap of branches just a few yards away. He aimed the flashlight in that direction but saw nothing. His heart pounded wildly. Was he being watched? Could it be the same figure Chris had glimpsed? A surge of adrenaline pushed him to step back. Another sound, louder this time, footsteps crushing leaves, then a faint hiss, some kind of whisper he couldn't make out. Was someone whispering his name? Terror latched onto his chest. He looked all around, but the flashlight revealed only twisted trees and rippling water. Fear crept in like poison, and he sprinted to his car, gripping the mask tightly. Once inside, he started the engine. The headlights swept across the shore, and for a second he thought he saw a thin figure duck behind some bushes. He hit the gas without hesitation, sweat dripping down his forehead. Whatever it was, it's out there, he muttered in panic. Chris was right all along. Mark stayed up all night, replaying that moment he'd felt someone's presence so clearly. Could it be that the boy's disappearance was the result of some vile ritual? The mask was hard evidence that something sinister lurked around Blackmore, but he needed help to discover the truth. He only knew one person who might believe him, Lisa Parker, the ex-police officer who once suggested conspiracy theories and got sidelined for it. He didn't have her number, but he knew where she worked. Early the next morning, he headed to the private investigation office she now ran. When Mark arrived, Lisa looked at him with disbelief. They hadn't seen each other in years. At 48, she still had the same stern gaze, scribbling furiously on a notepad. For a few seconds, she stayed silent, trying to gauge Mark's intentions. "Lisa," he began, "I know what I'm about to show you will sound totally insane, but please just give me a minute. Last night I found this mask on the shore of Blackmore Lake." She examined it and recognized something she'd long suspected, something linked to the rumors that swirled back during the original investigation. Her brow furrowed. How'd you get this?" she asked, flipping through her notepad's pages rapidly. Mark told her about his late-night trip and his son's journal. He explained how he felt someone watching him and how he fled, still shaking. Lisa listened closely, jotting notes. When he finished, she looked up, her expression grim. "This is exactly what I was worried about years ago. I tried to warn them it wasn't just an accident, but no one listened. They shut the investigation down. They kicked me out for insisting on baseless theories, or so they said. And now, you're telling me there's signs of rituals and masks?" Mark nodded silently. "I need your help, Lisa. I don't know who else to turn to. I don't trust the local police. You know better than anyone what went down during that first investigation." Lisa stood, her eyes flashing with resolve. "All right. Let's start with the basics. Old records, the people who lived by the lake in '98. Anything the police might have kept hidden. If someone tampered with evidence or if there were powerful interests, we have to find out." Hope surged through Mark. Something told him that with Lisa on his side, he might finally get justice for his son. Together, they headed to an abandoned police station, a red brick building with broken windows, where the town kept old files. Lisa still had keys from her time on the force. Inside, the place was dusty and reeked of mold. It wasn't pleasant, but it was the only spot that might hold documents that never saw the light of day. They started going through the stacked cardboard boxes labeled with dates from the late 90s. Many documents were in terrible shape. Lisa opened a folder of press clippings, witness statements, and police notes, most concerning the disappearance of St. James's wrestling team. She grimaced, recalling how she'd been removed from the case. Mark joined her, reading the pages. Among them, they found accounts from fishermen claiming they'd seen weird lights on the lake during the week the boys disappeared. Another statement mentioned hooded people, but there was no deeper inquiry. "Check this out," Lisa said, pointing to a report. "Anonymous tip about cults near Blackmore. No follow-up due to lack of evidence." Mark felt a wave of anger. Why didn't they pursue those leads? They kept digging until they found a document referencing a secret society called the Waters Order. It was signed by a sergeant who quit the force soon after the incident. The note mentioned clandestine rituals and the possibility of influential families being involved, yet the case was closed as a tragic accident. The sergeant left the station and was never heard from again, not even a phone number. "Can you believe this?" Lisa murmured, scanning the page. "We had it right in front of us and they ignored it." Mark took a deep breath, gritting his teeth. It was increasingly clear that Chris and the other boys might have been victims of something twisted that the town preferred to keep silent. Back at Lisa's office, they cross-referenced that report with Trowbridge's local history. They scoured the internet, digital archives, even church records. Mentions of the Waters Order showed up in 19th century accounts, describing it as a group devoted to purifying humanity through aquatic sacrifice. "So, it looks like this cult has been around for a long time," Mark said, scanning. "A dusty old text. Think the folks in Trowbridge know?" "I doubt most people know anything solid," Lisa replied. "They've probably heard rumors, but you know how small towns work. Fear hides behind silence." As the investigation went on, names of prominent citizens cropped up. Factory owners, former mayors, school principals. There was no direct proof they were involved with the order, but the coincidences were worrying. Could these people be protecting the cult? Mark remembered how, during the initial search for the boys, the authorities had seemed apathetic. They hardly ever brought proper diving teams and called off each mission at the slightest bad weather. Was it just negligence or deliberate cover-up? Amid the papers, they found an old flyer about an annual gathering held every September by the lake. The pamphlet seemed harmless, a water festival, with music, local food, cultural exhibits. But Lisa recalled getting a tip back in the day that behind this innocent facade, initiation rites were held in the wee hours. They decided to attend incognito at the next scheduled event, which happened to be just a few days away. It had been canceled recently due to the pandemic and organizational issues, but this time it was on again, apparently at midnight. The festival day arrived. Mark and Lisa showed up casually, blending in with the small crowd by the lake. There were colored lights, food stands, gentle music. Yet the atmosphere was nothing like the cheerful celebrations of the past. There was a forced vibe in the air. Maybe the town itself was tired of the gossip surrounding Blackmore. By about 2 in the morning, festivities died down. Many people left, but a smaller group headed into a clearing in the woods near the lake. Mark and Lisa followed at a safe distance, using small flashlights. They slipped down a path lined with oaks and thick brush, eventually reaching a clearing with a bonfire. Around the flames stood figures in hooded robes and white masks, chanting in a language they couldn't make out. A chill shot through Mark. His mind raced back to Chris's diary entries. Were these the same masked figures? Instinctively, he pulled out the mask he'd found to compare. It was a perfect match to what these robed strangers were wearing in the firelight. "That's the Waters Order," Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. "This is way worse than I imagined." Afraid of being spotted, Mark and Lisa stepped back, hiding behind a thick tree trunk. Even so, one of the robed individuals seemed to sense movement. He rose, staring in their direction. For a second, the clearing went silent, the chanting halted. Lisa stifled a gasp. She realized how much danger they were in. "We gotta bail," Mark muttered. But he hesitated. Part of him wanted to keep watching, to gather ironclad evidence. Still, caution screamed that surviving was priority one. They retreated as quietly as possible, trying not to rustle any branches, but the dry leaves crackled under their feet. Soon, they heard an uproar behind them, angry voices shouting orders. "Don't let them get away!" someone yelled in the distance. Panic overcame Mark. Lisa, more experienced, pulled him along, weaving between the undergrowth. They reached the lakeshore and ran without looking back. Nearby, they saw flashlights bobbing frantically. A gunshot rang out, echoing across the water. They dove behind an overturned boat, holding their breath. The pursuers' footsteps got closer. They heard cursing and threats. After a few tense minutes, the flashlight beams faded. Perhaps the cultists decided not to push further and risk drawing attention. Once the immediate threat seemed gone, Lisa and Mark crept away, both shaking. They hurried back to her office, the terror still fresh in their minds. But their suspicions were finally confirmed. A horrifying cult really did lurk in Trowbridge, and if the Waters Order had backing in high places, they'd be defenseless if they tried to go public without bulletproof proof. Safe at her desk, Lisa flipped through the photos and videos she'd discreetly taken. They couldn't perfectly capture each hooded figure, but the robes and the bonfire were clearly visible. Some of the masked faces were partially shown, confirming a ritual was in progress. It was progress, though the images were a bit grainy. Lisa studied every tiny detail. Every symbol on the robes, every marking on the masks, any of it might be a clue. They noticed something peculiar in the footage. The man who'd stood up by the fire wore a silver pin on his robe, an emblem of two wavy lines, like waves with a circle on top. It resembled certain motifs Lisa had come across in her research on local pagan sects. They decided to focus on this symbol to find out who was leading these ceremonies. Mark felt his anxiety growing. If these guys have survived in secret for over a century, they must have some powerful friends. Who's going to believe us? The next day, they tried talking to some of the town's older residents, hoping to find someone who remembered old rumors about the order. Most denied knowing anything. A few offered vague hearsay and spooky tales to scare kids. One old man with white hair and a twitchy gaze issued a warning. "If you folks know what's good for you, you'll stop poking your noses where they don't belong. Nothing good comes from messing with Trowbridge traditions. That lake's got secrets older than all of us." A chill ran through Mark at that eerie resignation. Was this old man part of the order, or just someone who knew too much? Meanwhile, Mark's memories of 1998 came flooding back stronger than ever. He recalled his last conversation with Chris, an argument over something trivial. Now he understood. His son had been hiding a much bigger secret, the knowledge of a real threat. The pain tore him up inside. The diary had been telling the truth all along. How terrified must Chris have been before he disappeared? "I have to find my son, or at least find out what really happened," Mark muttered. That determination pushed him onward despite the obvious dangers. Lisa felt a moral duty to correct the mistakes of the past. She'd been labeled a fantasist and paranoid back when she floated the idea of a cult in the initial investigation. Her reputation took a hit, and she nearly lost her career. Now she saw a chance to redeem herself. She was ready to swear before any judge that Trowbridge harbored a cult that sacrificed innocent people for some dark advantage. Fear shifted into a simmering anger. They both clung to the idea that somebody had to pay for the young lives cut short. Gathering information was no longer enough. They wanted solid proof to unmask the guilty. By day, they pored over archives and hunted for witnesses. By night, insomnia tormented them. Uncertainty gnawed at them like a rabid dog. How long until the order found out where they lived? Were they being watched? Seeing how serious the evidence was, Lisa and Mark thought about contacting someone in the police. But given the corruption they suspected, they worried that telling the wrong person could tip off the cult. So they sought out Officer Daniels, one of Lisa's former colleagues, now retired, a straight shooter with no debts to the institution. He'd been one of the few who supported Lisa when she was dismissed. After searching for him for days, they found him living in a modest neighborhood, almost like a recluse. I figured you'd come back about this eventually, Daniel said with a sigh. I felt guilty all these years, but I just didn't have it in me to fight such powerful people. We really need your testimony, Lisa insisted. You know what went down at the station when they shelved the investigation. You have to help us. The older man hesitated, then looked at Mark, whose grief was plain as day. Finally, he agreed to share what he remembered. He told them about how a local elite held sway, interfering in police and city hall to hide all sorts of skeletons. He mentioned that on the night the team disappeared, there were orders not to stir things up too much. Everything pointed to a tight grip by the Waters order. They were last seen on the road shortly before they vanished, Daniels admitted, and somebody reported chanting near the shore that same night, but the evidence magically disappeared. Mark's fists clenched. His son had been a victim of this monstrous cult that used the lake for rituals. The retired officer also confided there was a hidden area under an old mill near the ruins of Trowbridge's first textile factory. Whispers spoke of underground tunnels connecting to the lake, possibly where the cult performed its sacrifices. Be extra careful, Daniels warned. These people won't hesitate to eliminate threats. With this new lead, Mark felt a surge of urgency. If the mill connected to the lake and the order was using it, maybe he'd find evidence of the kids or anything that proved what happened. Lisa, more cautious, suggested setting up an operation with help from an external police unit. But Mark, desperate, feared any leak would blow their cover. I'm going tonight, he declared firmly. I can't wait any longer. You're not going alone, Lisa replied, despite her own fear. But we have to plan it. Remember what happened when they almost caught us in those woods? Mark nodded, throat tight. Still, he was driven by anxiety and guilt that overshadowed all caution. In the end, Lisa agreed to contact a couple of officers she trusted, telling them just enough to be on standby in case of an emergency. She wouldn't reveal much more to avoid putting them at risk. Shortly before midnight, Mark and Lisa arrived at the abandoned mill. Its moss-covered stone walls loomed in the darkness, windows shattered, roof partly caved in. Rumor had it that centuries ago, tunnels were dug beneath it to drain lake water into farmland. Moving quietly, they lit the entrance with their flashlights. Inside, they found rotted wooden beams, rusty old machines, and the overpowering smell of dampness. Rats scurried off as they stepped on creaky planks. They pressed on until they found a big gate locked with a heavy padlock. Lisa took out a lockpick, an old trick from her investigative work, and fiddled until the lock gave way, with a dull click. Beyond it lay a stone staircase, slippery with mold, leading down. With each step, the air grew thicker. The flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing an echo of distant voices and trickling water. A chill twisted their guts. They descended further, discovering a wide subterranean passage. The walls were engraved with strange designs of waves and stylized fish, and in the center was a crude altar with melted-down candles and dried wax. A steady drip echoed off the stones, forming a grimy puddle. The tension in the air was suffocating. Mark shined his flashlight across the altar. He saw claw marks, dark stains that could have been ancient blood. He swallowed hard. How many people had suffered here? Had Chris been brought to this same spot? A few steps beyond, the corridor opened into a larger chamber with rocky pillars. There they spotted several people dressed in black robes and white masks. At the center stood one who seemed to be their leader, wearing a silver pin, the same emblem from the photos. He was chanting something in a rough, guttural language. Abruptly, the chanting stopped, and he turned to face the direction where Mark and Lisa were hiding. His footsteps boomed in the hush. One of the cultists, brandishing a knife, approached them. Who dares defile the sanctuary of the waters? The leader roared, his voice echoing off the walls. Mark and Lisa exchanged alarmed glances. They had nowhere to run without being seen. They decided to show themselves, raising their flashlights and momentarily blinding the masked group. We want justice, Mark said defiantly. Tell us what you did to the St. James wrestling team back in '98. Where's my son? The leader let out a shrill, almost inhuman laugh. He removed his mask, revealing a scarred face and eyes devoid of mercy. He looked middle-aged but carried an ancient cruelty in his expression. "You have no idea what you're messing with. Our sacrifices are an offering to the lake, to the powers that grant us prosperity. You cannot stop us. The entire town benefits from our rights." Fury burned in Mark's veins. He lunged at the man, but two cultists blocked him, restraining him roughly. Lisa tried to help but got knocked down hard. Her flashlight rolled across the floor, illuminating a corner of the chamber where torn clothing lay. Mark let out a guttural cry when he recognized a t-shirt bearing the St. James logo. Tears of rage burst from his eyes. "Enough!" bellowed the leader. "We'll offer these intruders to the depths." He raised his knife to kill Mark, but suddenly an explosion shook the tunnels. Rocks quaked, bits of ceiling fell, and blue and red lights flashed in the distance. It was the police, force Lisa had secretly summoned. Officers charged through the passage, yelling commands. A flurry of gunshots and screams reverberated in the underground chamber, each echo as loud as thunder in the darkness. Mark mustered all his strength to break free from his captors. He saw the leader fleeing through another side tunnel and sprinted after him. He caught him in a dim corner lit only by a single torch. They wrestled violently, the knife grazing Mark's arm and cutting him. Pain shot through him, but he was fueled by the rage of losing his son. With a final burst of strength, he rammed the leader against the wall and disarmed him. "Where are the bodies?" Mark roared, hands shaking with fury. The leader refused to speak, spitting insults. Then Lisa showed up with a couple of officers who cuffed the man. The cult was being taken down. Some of its members had escaped, but many were captured. Over the next few hours, the police discovered adjacent chambers, containing belongings of the missing kids, mute witnesses to those monstrous acts. They dubbed the operation the Raid, and it caused a massive scandal. The whole of Trowbridge was shocked to learn that some of its most respectable citizens were behind grisly cult rituals. The police uncovered irrefutable proof that the St. James wrestling team had been kidnapped and murdered as part of a tribute meant to nourish the lake. They found the remains of several boys in makeshift graves near the tunnels and in underwater caves. Mark was devastated but also somewhat relieved to finally bury Chris and mourn him with the truth laid bare. He discovered his son had fought to the bitter end, leaving a record of his fears so someone could eventually uncover the truth. The grieving father stood at the funeral, head bowed, feeling a bittersweet peace, mingled with the anger of having spent 20 years in uncertainty. Lisa was there too, moved, holding Mark in a consoling embrace. They shared a bond forged by sorrow and perseverance. Further investigations uncovered the names of business owners and public officials who had funded the Waters Order for decades. Among those arrested were people who attended the midnight gathering. Federal authorities took over the case, gathering testimonies and interrogating cult members. Evidence confirmed that this sect had performed routine sacrifices across several generations. The disappearance of the wrestling team in 1998 was one of their largest crimes, hidden by collective silence. News spread across England and soon the world. Trowbridge went from a quaint rural town to the site of a gruesome cult. Many residents felt ashamed. Others cried innocence and blamed a few evildoers, maintaining that most folks hadn't known. The tragedy drew the missing kids, families together, finally able to give their children proper burials and move toward closure. It didn't erase the pain, but it allowed them to look forward. Mark and Lisa were hailed as local heroes, though neither felt particularly heroic. Lisa had reclaimed her honor, proving her instincts and research were valid, yet she still carried psychological scars. For days, nightmares of knives, chanting, and masked figures invaded her sleep, as did the memory of gunshots and screams echoing underground. Mark carried a wound on his arm that would take time to heal. The emotional wound, however, was deeper. Sometimes he'd jolt awake at night calling out Chris's name. A memorial was held in the town square. Candles, photos, flowers, and messages of condolences filled the area, where a small monument was erected with the names of all the young people who died that fateful September of '98. Mark placed a photo of Chris in his wrestling uniform, smiling, as if, in that way, he could give his son the tribute he never had. No fanfare, no lengthy speeches, just a heartfelt farewell and an apology. Slowly, the town tried to move on. Some voices argued for demolishing the mill completely to erase that awful past, while others insisted on leaving it as is, so future generations would remember that evil can hide anywhere, even in a supposedly peaceful setting. The debate went on, feeding a broader conversation about Trowbridge's identity and its history. Ultimately, the authorities sealed off and fortified the subterranean entrances, but left the building standing. A metal plaque was placed out front, stating, "Let these ruins bear witness to the shadows we once harbored, that such horrors may never again hide in silence." With slightly lighter consciences, Mark and Lisa met one day by the shores of Blackmore Lake. The same lake that, for so long, held the town's darkest secrets. Now they gazed at the calm surface, feeling the breeze gently rustle the poplar trees. Lisa tossed a stone, sending ripples across the water. "I can't help wondering if our loved ones' spirits have finally found peace," she whispered. Mark closed his eyes, clutching the wrestling medal Chris used during practice, found among the items recovered in the temple. "I want to believe they have," he answered, gazing at the sky with tears welling up. They stayed like that for a while, sharing a sorrowful solace. Eventually, Lisa pulled out her notebook to jot down reflections on her next steps. She intended to collaborate with specialized agencies that investigate criminal sects, using her experience to help prevent similar tragedies. Mark, for his part, considered returning to teaching, maybe at a distant school, where he could teach young people the importance of truth and justice. He still remembered the night he found that mask on the shore. Sometimes he wondered if the presence lurking among the trees had been just a person or something older, more monstrous, fed by worship and blood. Now, however, he wanted to focus on living out the years he had left in the best way possible. Every corner of the lake seemed to hold stories. Every tree stood as a silent witness to crimes committed in the dark. The locals no longer saw Blackmore with naive eyes. Part of nature, once innocent, was now stained with horror. Still, the power of truth had shattered a long-kept silence. Hope emerged for the living, and perhaps even for those who were never heard. Some silences last for decades. Some wounds take years to heal. But the town awoke from a shared nightmare by confronting its past. The white mask, the cult, the sacrifices. They became a reminder of what happens when fear and complicity freeze a community into silence. After the fall of the Waters Order, several members fled, and warrants were issued, sparking a frenzy in the media and within institutions. Though Mark feared other similar cults might still exist, at least in Trowbridge, the underground mill had changed from a lair of darkness into a symbol of justice. For months he gathered testimonies and evidence into a report for the families, giving them painful but much-needed clarity. In time, the town began calling those events the Blackmore Purge. Mark and Lisa avoided the spotlight, opting for quiet lives as the community respected their names for exposing the horror. To this day, when the wind stirs the waters of Blackmore, people remember the souls released there and wonder whether evil truly dies once it's exposed, or if it could have been stopped sooner. The truth came out, but the scars remain, a silent warning for everyone.